Okay, I'd like to talk to you today on the topic of woke, and I would like to do this under three aspects. First of all, to consider wokeness as part of the history of ideas. Secondly, to consider whether when we think about wokeness, we best do so either in a substantive or methodological way. And thirdly, what happens once one gets woke? Don't go back to sleep. Let's start with the history of ideas. Now, the phrase stay woke became popular in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the specific topic to which people became woke in the past decade was systematic racial injustice. The Trayvon Martin incident, the Michael Brown incident, the Tamir Rice incident, the hashtag stay woke became a part of common parlance. But although the phrase stay woke became popular in connection with the Black Lives Matter movement, both the phrase and the idea go back further. As a trope within Black speech, for example, wokeness can be traced back at least to the 1930s. It was used throughout that period. The earliest documented example is a song by Leadbelly talking about the Scottsboro Boys. So wokeness in the current sense did not appear out of the blue in the last decade. As a linguistic trope and common currency, the core insight is even older still. Far back in the history of ideas, woke is a very basic idea, in fact, and it keeps getting rediscovered. How basic? What do you see here? Well, it looks like a shadow of a man with a top hat and an umbrella. And normally when we see a shadow, we do expect the shadow to resemble the image which casts that shadow. Well, in this case, the shadow of the man in the top hat and the umbrella is cast by something that doesn't look at all like a man in a top hat with an umbrella or a man at all. This is a question, a basic question. Are we dreaming of shadows? And it's the question, of course, that Plato raised 2,400 years ago in his allegory of the cave. So the idea of wokeness, of being asleep and being deceived and coming out of that state really goes back quite far. If you don't know the story, in Plato's allegory of the cave, there are a bunch of guys, they've come up in a cave all their lives, they've been chained there, and all they can see is the wall in front of them. There are shadows cast on that wall because there's a fire behind them. Of course, they can't see the fire, they don't know what a fire is. And the jailers, just to be persnickety, run these little images across in front of the firelight, and that casts some dim shadows on the wall, and this is what the prisoners see. It's sort of like, when you do this sort of thing, you cast a bird shadow on the wall. Well, as it turns out, one day, one of the prisoners breaks his chains, and he sneaks out of the cave. What do you think happens to him? Well, first of all, he's blinded by the light. It's kind of painful. If you've ever had anyone wake you up, with the flip of the lights, which my father used to love to do this. I hated it. It's not painful, it's discomforting, but then, eventually your sight comes back. And this is what happens to this fellow. And he sees things that he's never seen before. He sees colors. First of all, in the cave, and the light level was so low, all they saw was black and white and shades of gray. We as humans have two different kinds of light receptors in our visual system. We have what are called rods and cones. The cones operate in higher levels of light, and they're what allow us to see color. The rods operate in lower levels and see black, white, and gray. By the way, dogs don't have color vision as we do. So if you're thinking about buying your dog a TV, just go for the black and white. You don't need to waste your money on the color. In any case, he sees things that he's not seen before. Not only colors, he sees shapes, he sees horses and other people like him, and he sees grass, and he sees trees, and he sees the sky, and he sees water. And he looks at his hand, and he sees clearly his own digits, and he notices other people, same sort of thing. And so, he's just knocked out by this, and all of a sudden he comes to himself, and he realizes, oh my God, my friends are back in the cave. So let me sneak back in there and let them know what's out here. And so he does. He sneaks back in the cave. He tells the story to his friends. And what do you think they do? They laugh at him. You're an idiot. This is all there is. Why are you telling us about some imaginary world outside of the real world? This is Plato's story, story of the cave and metaphor for what happens to the philosopher. It takes some work and it's painful to achieve insight, but then when you try to communicate that insight to the average person, they tend to laugh at the philosopher. For Plato, though, living in the world of twilight and shadows is not a good thing, the twilight world of change and decay, as he puts it. We see only the things that are least real, we miss the real things. This is not a phrase that Plato himself uses, but in effect what he's saying is we all suffer, most of us, most of the time, from cave consciousness. Cave consciousness is a kind of sleep, and finding one's way out of the cave is a kind of awakening. Does this sound familiar? Shouldn't Plato be receiving screenwriting residuals for The Matrix?
The Matrix. You gotta remember the humans floating around in the vats of KY jelly, tubes and wires keeping them alive, stimulating their brains to make them believe that they were experiencing the real world, the world we all think we know. Well, almost 20-year-old spoiler alert here, some of them come out and find that the real world was a desolate wasteland and the lives everyone thought they were living were just fabrications fed into their brains. A select few were rescued from the illusion, but some of them were so unhappy in the real world that they chose to return to the illusion. But Neo and the others who chose to stay and fight were the philosophical heroes of the movie, choosing truth at the cost of comfort and happiness.
Yeah, so
The Matrix.
the characters in The Matrix were the original woke guys. Wake up, The Matrix has you. But what is The Matrix except Plato's cave reimagined? What is wokeness like, according to Plato? What happens once we exit the cave? The physical eye deceives, says Plato. Knowledge is really about ideas, things which we can't sense but which we intuit. It's not about the sensate one, so we need to cultivate our mind's eye. It's with our mind's eye rather than with the physical eye that we acquire knowledge. And our physical eye is useless if and when the mind is blind. But most of us walk about, Plato thinks, with our mind's eyes wide shut. Eyes wide shut because the superficial twilight world of change, decay, and shadows, which the physical eye sees, living in the cave, distracts us from realities which otherwise the mind's eye might perceive. So that ordinary sense experience really stands in the way of good sense. As in The Matrix, what most people call the real world, quote unquote, is for Plato the least real. Rather, what's most real is what escapes ordinary sensory perception. If we struggle to look beyond it, though, the mind's eye might hope to come and grasp it. Plato's big takeaway from this realization: there ain't no way to hide your lying eyes. This is going to become characteristic of philosophical rationalism. We should mistrust what our senses teach us or seem to teach us. Now, this is upside down from the standpoint of most people. For Plato, the real is the unseen is the real. In consequence of this, Plato thinks most of us are deceived ordinarily, thoroughly, and most of the time. In other words, although again, this term is not Plato's term, we are mired in false consciousness. Whose term is false consciousness? This guy's. Marx is famous for this notion. We're deceived routinely about our circumstances, particularly about money. You know, Marx is still worth reading, and one of the reasons is he's so sardonic. Marx's take is basically, I can tell you're lying to me, your lips are moving, and the subject is money. Plato, though, was much more radical than Marx. Plato thinks that false consciousness goes much, much deeper than Marx even imagined. Marx thought we were deceived about money. Plato thinks we're deceived about everything. However, their message is the same in both cases: quit your sleepwalking. Now, people don't like to hear this, but this is the philosophy wake-up call. Whether it's from Plato, whether it's from Marx, whether it's from Jean-Paul Sartre, or this other philosopher, who is this over here? The message is the same. You'd best unscrew yourself. Private Cowboy, did the proctologist find your head yet? Psychologists suspect that some people may be delusional. Philosophers suspect that all people may be delusional, and Plato is the one who started it. Has anyone ever heard of beer goggles? Beer goggles? Plato's message is we all wear cave goggles. Now, do beer goggles work? Oh, yes, they do, but is that a recommendation for them? Not necessarily. Here's proof, by the way, that they do work. 8 o'clock, she's pretty ugly. By 10 o'clock, looking better, and by closing time, you done drunk that poor girl pretty. And unless one thinks this is a sexist point, the male version is down at the bottom, same. For Plato, to learn philosophy is a lot like sobering up, como un plato de menudo, getting rid of the beer goggles or the cave goggles. The cure for being stuck in that twilight world of change and decay, the cure for remaining a prisoner to matters of fact as conveyed by the physical senses, being mired in cave consciousness and stuck behind those cave goggles, is to get woke. So Plato's the original woke guy. Join the Plato's Cave Alumni Association. Get out of the cave. Do graduate, please. Now, Plato's specific awakening led him to a view we call Platonism, the substantive view that, first of all, what's most real is what we do not and cannot see. What we do see is misleading, and the tangible world is the least real. The world of ideas is the most real. Now, there's an upside to this. This is to awaken to critical thought. It's to learn not just to trust experiences. Don't let the mind's eye be blind. Perceive what's really there. There's a downside to this too, because Platonism congealed into just one more form of conventional wisdom with its own blind spots. Plato wasn't the end of philosophy, after all. In the history of ideas, not everyone has embraced Platonism substantively. Subsequently, other key philosophers have had to use the sleeping-waking metaphor to wake up once again. For example, in the 17th century, early modern times, the scientific revolution, Sir Francis Bacon worried that the received wisdom of the past, and he targets Aristotle particularly, but he might have said just the same thing about Plato. This wisdom is congealed into just another idol of the mind, as he called it, just another set of shackles. So, hello, Fresh. What we need to do is we need to abandon the reforms of antiquity and have a new reformation to wake up all over again, because Platonism, as it develops, just turns out to be one alternative version of sleepwalking. Shortly after Bacon, René Descartes. Descartes worries, we get deceived when we're dreaming. Sometimes it's hard to tell when we're sleeping and dreaming. We might be dreaming when we think we're awake. I could be dreaming now that I'm awake and I'm actually asleep. If I can be deceived once, and I know I can be because dreams tell me that I can, how do I know that I'm not being deceived more than that, even all the time? It's a problem. So getting woke, again, a major theme. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant comes along, he reads David Hume, and it wakes him up. David Hume, says Kant famously, first interrupted my dogmatic slumber. Are we just enthralled to the conventional wisdom, or are we just sleeping through it all? And then, of course, in the 19th century, there was this guy who seems to think that the invisible hand has been picking our pocket all along. Now, this raises the question, when we talk about wokeness, are we talking about something substantive, or are we talking about something methodological? How do you tell if you're woke? Is it because you hold the appropriate set of substantive views? Is it because you approach issues in a certain manner? For example, I suppose we could have a wokeness checklist, so the more items you can tick off on your checklist, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, reparations, it's natural to want to have a future, Black Lives Matter. The more you can tick off, the more woke you are. Probably this isn't very helpful, although maybe a reverse checklist would be better. You can kind of tell better who's non-woke than by means of a checklist. Often those who criticize wokeness, Bill Maher, for example, is one of them, have in mind specific substantive views such as cancel culture or deplatforming, etc. Now, Plato did state an original and powerful case for wokeness, but we don't use some sort of Platonism checklist to assess wokeness. So we don't say you're woke if you believe with Plato that ideas are innate and that sense experience is bad for you and that ideas are prior to material reality and so on and so forth. Just because someone embraces the substantive views to which Plato says he himself awoke, does this make them woke too? This ain't woke. If you work for Creativity Corporation and your boss tells you thou shalt stay woke, go back in your cubicle and start thinking outside the box. What's wrong with this picture? Christopher Hitchens, I think, hits the nail on the head here when he says the following.
But further to the principles of free inquiry and open debate that goes up to make a great university, my view is, and will always be, that it matters not what you think. Anyone can have thoughts. Many people content themselves with feelings. It matters how you think.
Yes, it matters not what you think, it matters how you think. So what if we think of wokeness as a matter of how rather than what? A matter of method rather than substance. Methodological wokeness, what would it look like? Well, it might look like, for example, connecting the dots. It's a very good example of this, although I'm talking as a philosophy teacher. I'm going to use the example here of a sociologist of the mid-20th century, C Wright Mills. In 1959, he published a book called The Sociological Imagination, in which he started by drawing a distinction between two things: troubles and issues. We have personal troubles of milieu, as he put it. We have public issues of social structure. Now, often, to many people, these two things seem to be disconnected. Mills asks, are they? And he gives the following example. Marriage. Inside a marriage, a man and a woman may experience personal troubles, but when the divorce rate during the first 4 years of marriage is 250 out of every 1,000 attempts, this is an indication of a structural issue having to do with the institutions of marriage and the family and other institutions that bear upon them. Bill gives another example. Employment. When in a city of 100,000, only one man is unemployed, that's his personal trouble. But when in a nation of 50 million employees, 15 million men are unemployed, that is an issue. And we may not hope to find its solution within the range of opportunities open to any one individual. The very structure of opportunities has collapsed. Here's another example. Up to a certain point, Black people in Mississippi did not have issues, they had troubles. If you know the book or the film, The Help, you know what I'm talking about. But the civil rights movement comes along, and it now begins to frame troubles as problems, as issues that can be addressed collectively. Here's another example, again, not Mill's example. The Victorians were scandalized, shocked that working women were subjected to the troubles of prostitution. But early feminist reformers raised the issue that female jobs didn't pay enough to live on. Typical job for a woman this period was seamstress work. Seamstress work didn't feed the bulldog, and so prostitution was needed to supplement it. In fact, the word seamstress was a euphemism for prostitute at one point. Talk about your original gig economy. There you have it. Now, Mills didn't live into our time of internet memes, but if he did, I think he might post something like this. I don't always have personal troubles, but when I do, I prefer connecting them to public issues. The woke imagination. Methodically, discipline oneself to see the bigger picture puzzle, not just the individual pieces. Collect them together to show the relationship between personal troubles, structural and historical change, on the other hand. In other words, connect the dots between troubles and issues. Now, Mill wrote this over 60 years ago. Why would we want to read him today? Isn't this just ancient history? I think it's not, and for two reasons. This has to do with the intervention in those last 60 years of economic inequality and an intervention during the same time of a neoliberal ideology which justifies that inequality. We live in a time now in the early 21st century in which economic inequality has reverted to levels unknown for nearly a century. And this is no accident. It's a result of deliberate policy choices directly, and a corresponding reversion in the history of ideas, revival of some older ideas with which we had at least hitherto dispensed. I want you to take a look at a graph. This is truly an astounding graph. It doesn't come from Mills. This comes more recently from Piketty and Sens. Here you see the pre-tax income share of the top 0.1% of Americans over the course of about a century. And you see what happens is it goes from, let me just put my marker here. It goes from a big spike here in the beginning of the 20th century, followed by a trough, what economists call the Great Compression. The French call it les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years following World War II, glorious years for the middle class. And then what happens at the end of the 20th century and into our own century is that that spike begins to rise once again. This is truly, I think, an astounding picture. Mills wrote during the midst of this recovery, the midst of the 30 glorieuses, and recovering from the Great Depression of 1929. The middle class at that time was benefiting from unskewing the extremely disparate wealth distribution that we had known in the in the Gilded Age beforehand. And what's happened since is that while productivity has continued to rise, real median family income has flattened out. You can see that from the bottom diagram. The middle class then lost ground, and in part it did so due to decreased governmental regulation and taxation from the 1980s, followed by the crash of 2008, the second greatest economic downturn since 1929. I'm speaking to you now in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and we may not have seen the worst yet. In any case, wealth became skewed once again, as it had been before. Some economists have referred to this as the new Gilded Age, our own time. And during that time, the middle class becomes hollowed out. More people become extremely rich or extremely poor, and the middle shrinks. So that perhaps the middle class in the U.S. has become like the bison. They once inhabited a vast swath of North America, but their numbers have been greatly reduced. It's not just in this country. In the UK, the same sort of thing. Where did the other runny go? More high end, more low end, and less in the middle. And in other countries as well. Emmanuel Macron, the current president of the French Republic, famously said, "Une guerre, c'est un lieu où on croise les gens qui réussissent et les gens qui ne sont rien." When you go through a train station, you come across people who are successful and people who are nothing. So Macron looks like he's not awake there. It's like in Hollywood where you're either a player or a gopher, and there's no middle ground. Starting in the 1980s, Mr. Reagan in this country, Mrs. Thatcher in the UK, pursued a policy of devolution. Well, actually, my head is covering up. Keep calm and starve the beast. Policies that cut taxes and downsize government spending and regulation. Under the theory, as Lucy tells Charlie Brown, if you cut taxes on the rich, they'll invest that money and create jobs for everyone. Yeah, and she's going to hold that ball for you, Charlie, when you kick it. Thatcher and Reagan revived a social and economic theory which said that when the rich get richer, their wealth, quote, trickles down, unquote, to those below, and that the only route to any collective good is to unleash and empower individuals and to disempower government. This sometimes goes by the phrase neoliberalism, although one might wonder if this is either liberal or neo. It's certainly not new. It really does revive a viewpoint from the 19th century. By the way, Karl Polanyi referred to this as market fundamentalism, and the recent book by Block and Summers on Polanyi is really quite good in this respect. I would recommend it. The revival was criticized by Reagan's own vice president, George H.W. Bush, as voodoo economics, the revival of an old economic set of ideas that had been tried and found wanting. John Kenneth Galbraith comments on that. Supply-side economics was merely a cover for the trickle-down approach to economic policy, which an older and less elegant generation called the horse and sparrow theory. If you feed the horse enough oats, some will pass through on the road for the sparrows. Mrs. Thatcher herself drew the logical consequence of all this when she said, "Who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families." The neoliberal ideology as articulated here by Mrs. Thatcher, of course, runs completely counter to what Mills said. She asserts rather than there being personal troubles in milieu, which could and should be understood in terms of public issues of social structure, that there are only personal troubles with no possible connections at all to public issues. So despite the fact that it's been 60 years since Mills wrote, there is now about the popular ideology that personal troubles are, well, really only just that. They're personal, they're idiosyncratic, they're deeply mysterious, they don't have any larger explanation. And as Mrs. Thatcher also famously said, TINA, there is no alternative to this point of view. Now, she's been gone, and so has Mr. Reagan, for some time. Their ideas have not, subsequent administrations, both on this side of the Atlantic and on the other and elsewhere as well, continue this point of view. I mentioned that I'm giving this talk as a philosophy teacher. Mills, of course, is a sociologist rather than a philosopher. But what he says in the Sociological Imagination, it seems to me, was said just as well by Bertrand Russell, Mr. Philosophy himself. I don't like to read slides to you, but let me just take a minute to do this. it's worth hearing. Bertrand Russell said, "The life of the instinctive man is shut up within the circle of his private interests. Family and friends may be included, but the outer world is not regarded except as it may help or hinder what comes within the circle of instinctive wishes. The private world of instinctive interests is a small one, set in the midst of a great and powerful world which must sooner or later lay our private world in ruins. Unless we can so enlarge our interests as to include the whole outer world, we remain like a garrison in a beleaguered fortress, knowing that the enemy prevents escape and that ultimate surrender is inevitable." But it's weird. It's as if there was a parallel universe in which, in one, C Wright Mills writes The Sociological Imagination, and another, Mrs. Thatcher writes a book called The Sociological Unimagination. And in fairness, not all politicians incline this way. I'm old enough to remember when we used to talk about a great society, about the prospect that we could better things through the political order. So it may be worth remembering that. But is there then something to be said for Mill's point of view? Well, yes, as long as we're not too shocked. Sorry, a little thing here. Options. There. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Yes, like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz or Captain Bueno in Casablanca, I'm shocked to find that structure, policy, and issues have consequences for personal troubles. Oh my goodness. Homelessness. Is it a trouble or an issue? Well, you see one homeless guy sleeping on a bench. Maybe he's made some bad choices. He seems down and out because of personal fecklessness, but and city officials take this point of view, by the way. The mayor of Los Angeles looks at Skid Row and says, oh my goodness, how could this possibly happen? But when cheaper housing in Los Angeles gets torn down to build these Fotalian fortresses of Mr. Palmer's, then housing costs soar. These buildings were built on land that the housing may have been substandard, but at least, it provided some housing other than a tent. Right now, the average monthly individual income in Los Angeles is about $2,300. The median rental is $2,400 for a house. Most apartments start at about $1,500. Most Americans cannot raise $400 in an emergency. So there are people living in really substandard housing, but indoors, and they are just one firing, paycheck loss, downturn, any of those things away from being there in those tents on the street. Is it really surprising that so many people live in tents? Psst, Dorothy, connect the dots. Shelter poverty. It's possible to have a house or have a dwelling place indoors and still be poor, maybe impoverished as a result of that. Is that a trouble or is that an issue? Well, it's particularly hard for Black people to buy housing, but there's also a long history of redlining. Banks would basically say, we're not going to lend to people in this neighborhood, or draw a red line around it, of shutting Black people out of FHA loans. Surely this must have something to do with the collective imbalance in home equity and therefore in overall generational wealth. This is surprising. The subprime mortgage foreclosure, is this a trouble or an issue? Some people who did have homes lost them to the foreclosure following the economic meltdown in 2008. So they not only put your business in the street, they put your furniture there too. In fact, many people, upwards of 9 million from just before the crisis hit to sometime after, lost their homes. This was due to the deregulation of banking, one of the neoliberal policies, and the unchecked ability to issue and then commodify bundles of mortgages, which came about from that sort of Reagan-Thatcher style devolution. Student debt loan, trouble or issue? The average student loan is about $30,000, can go as high as $200,000, and that may be an underestimate. Many individuals are never going to be able to start a family or buy a house. You're going to be living in an apartment with roommates sharing for the rest of your life. Massive neoliberal tax cuts have made states shift the burden of paying for college more and more toward increasing tuition. If you look at the graph at the bottom, between 1980 and 2010, yes, costs have risen for various things, tuition costs the highest by far, 1,200%. As Gomer Pyle might have said, surprise, surprise, surprise. What happens to a dream deferred, as Langston Hughes famously asked? That's a dream being deferred. And what happens to dreaming deferred? Brings us to immigration. Is that a trouble or an issue? Some immigrants are dying trying. Others wind up in cages and concentration camps. And this is not just about the U.S.-Mexico border, build that wall and all this. It's a worldwide issue. Whether fleeing economic hardship or political repression or both from the global south, many people are risking their lives dreaming of a better future. So we're just shocked, shocked, shocked. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. The ascendance of neoliberalism in our own era is not, of course, the only reason why Mill's distinction between troubles and issues becomes important. And if Plato, Bacon, Descartes, Hume, Kant, Marx, the whole philosophical tradition offer any indication, the importance of wokeness isn't new either. It is important to connect the dots between troubles and issues. But how do we think about methodological wokeness? Let me suggest one tool for doing that, known as the Overton Window. Wokeness is not, it seems to me, limited to the dimension of individual consciousness raising. It has a collective dimension as well. And one useful tool for gauging this is known as the Overton Window. If you're familiar, for example, with Halland's spheres, they're kind of similar. They talk about, or allow us to talk about the way in which ideas move from the sphere of deviance into the sphere of legitimate controversy. That's a move which has happened, does tend to happen with various ideas. Some of them, not all of them, not all of the time. The Overton Window tries to do more or less the same thing. I'm going to focus today on the Overton Window rather than the Halland spheres. Now, this window, Overton Window, refers to the fact that with respect to a possible range of views on any subject, some of them are going to be normalized. That's represented by the framework of the window in yellow here. The conventional wisdom, if you will, as Galbraith put it. And other views are going to be thought too outlandish to merit serious consideration, too radical, even ridiculous. Noam Chomsky, he's certainly someone who's held some ideas considered outlandish for many years, notes the following: either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. However, that sounds grim. An Overton window might also get stretched wider. For example, in the past, the Overton window for thinking about child sexual abuse was confined to the marginal deviant in the raincoat, Chester the molester. And lately, the window for thinking about child abuse has grown, has expanded, to think about family members, to think even about clergy. Just as child abusers are not just old men in raincoats, rapists and sexual abusers are not just marginal guys lurking in the alleys. They could be lurking in the boardrooms and the corner offices as well. Alcoholism. The lush life is not just about vagrant winos, it's about Chardonnay as well as Mad Dog 2020. And guess what? There is such a thing as white-collar crime. Criminals are not just those guys in the masks and striped shirts. STDs are transmitted not only by sex workers, but also by the girl next door, the guy next door, too. So again, it's a broader way of thinking about a topic than was hitherto the standard. Some time ago, the Overton window for government believability got stretched. In the early 1960s, journalists were very deferential toward political leaders. If you look at press conferences by President Kennedy, for example, the same thing is true of press conferences by President de Gaulle in France. The reporters are stenographers. They're just copying down everything that's said, and they print it. Once it became clear, at least in this country, that American presidents lied routinely, about Vietnam, about Watergate, then going back to that old normal deference just was no longer possible. In the recent past, the Overton window for thinking about electoral politics was defined by center-right Democrats like the Clintons and Obama, and right Republicans like George W. Bush. Recently, though, it's stretched a bit. with Ms. Warren, Mr. Ocasio-Cortez, Mr. Sanders, maybe not as far as Neptune, Noam Chomsky is still out there, but issues like universal single-payer health care, free college, serious rules imposed upon capitalism, these have now become normalized. The Black Lives Matter movement also succeeded in stretching an Overton window on perceptions about racial injustice. It's not just the guy in the white hood, it's the guys in the blue uniforms. Now, the Overton window can stretch in various directions, and with the advent of Mr. Trump and his buddy Steve Bannon, we began to discuss ideas that hitherto would not have been within the realm of fair play. An Overton window might also shrink. Franklin Roosevelt expanded it a bit. This is something that I think kind of got lost in the shuffle of World War II, but in 1944, in his inaugural address, State of the Union address, sorry, Franklin Roosevelt put forward a second Bill of Rights. We've come back to this recently. It's worth looking at what he said in 1944. This is an American president. Every American has the right to a job. Every American has the right to an adequate wage and decent living, not by your grace and favor, a right. Every American has a right to a decent home, a right to medical care, a right to economic protection during sickness, accident, old age, or unemployment. Every American has a right to a good education. Well, that Overton window has shrunk. Economic expectations, which might have been normal under Franklin Roosevelt, even under Eisenhower, have now come to seem outlandish and extraplanetary, although this is still being contended. But the window expanded by relatives subsequently shrunk. So, what does this say about wokeness and Overton windows? Well, not all changes in Overton windows necessarily betoken wokeness, okay? So just because Overton window stretches doesn't tell you anything about whether we're getting brighter or dimmer. On the other hand, to the extent that large numbers of people do get woke to one issue or another, one should look for a corresponding broadening of the relevant Overton window. So that's a tool, methodologically, I think, for thinking about wokeness. And this brings me to my third and final point. What happens after you get woke? Don't hit the snooze button. Plato may have been the original woke guy, but that didn't stop his followers from hitting the snooze button, as Bacon at least complained, and others have subsequently as well. Woke ain't necessarily forever one and done. It's not a new revelation handed down on stone tablets, just one more set of thou shalt nots. If wokeness, as I'm suggesting, is best appreciated methodologically, doesn't it stand to reason that it's going to be ongoing? Won't it require some work? So let me summarize. 3 points. First of all, the idea of wokeness is not just recent. Certainly it's not to be dismissed as just some passing fancy or fad. On the contrary, wokeness is a mainstream core idea. It keeps coming up in philosophy, in social science, indeed as a mainstay of what it means to talk about critical thinking as a feature of a liberal education. So, it's right there, in center stage in the history of ideas. And lastly, it not only got discovered, it keeps being rediscovered. More than that, insofar as it's methodological rather than substantive, wokeness positively needs to be rediscovered from one time to the next. So what Alfred Adler said, I think, strikes me as good advice. Follow your heart, but take your brain with you. Or as Martin Luther King said, dream, or might have said, actually, it's paraphrasing him, dream but stay woke. Oh, am I the only one that thinks that Plato was with that guy? Thank you. I've been talking to you on the subject of woke. My name is Michael Cavanaugh. Good day.